Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip is the first in a series on the changes to the 2021 GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors, contracts. So I am so excited to begin this series introducing you to the changes that the Forms Committee for the Georgia Association of Realtors made for the contract package for real estate agents in Georgia for the year 2021. So just want to let you know that this video series is just a brief introduction to some of those changes. I encourage you to take a class on all of the changes. I am also the director of the Georgia Real Estate Academy, and we have approved classes for 2021 GAR contract changes, and we already have them scheduled and ready to go. We are teaching 3 classes in December 2020, and we'll continue those throughout January in 2021. So I will link those are being taught virtually. I will link the calendar below and welcome you to take the class. It is called the 2021 GAR Contract Changes, offered through the Georgia Real Estate Academy, which is Grec School 6915, and hosted by Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. Again, those classes are virtual, and I will link the calendar below. So invite you to be among the first to see the 2021 changes through the class, and stay tuned for this ongoing video series of a brief introduction to some of the changes as we go on. So without further ado, I want to tell you about the first change. Well, not the first change. There's a lot of the majority of the changes this year are actually to the brokerage engagements. Really not a lot to the purchase and sale agreement. Mostly to the brokerage engagements, new construction, and some other changes. But what I want to start off with today is a brand new form. And it's really interesting how about this form. I think... well, I'm not going to tell you what I think right now. Let me go over and introduce you to this form, and let's talk about it. So the form is, hold on, and I'll tell you what the form is. All right. It is a brand new form, as I mentioned, and it is GAR Contract. GAR, again, stands for Georgia Association of Realtors. It is form number F290, Agreement to Reinstate Contract. So let me talk a little bit about this form and what's on there, and then let me give you guys some examples as to when and how you would use this form. So F290, Agreement to Reinstate Contract. And you fill in the name of the buyer and the seller and the property address and reference the binding agreement date, just like you do with any form that the parties sign after they have been binding. And basically what it says is, now therefore for and in consideration of $10, because you have to have consideration for enforceability. But again, as with any of these forms, the $10 does not actually change hands. And other good and valuable consideration, the receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged. Buyer and seller hereby agree to the following. Number 1, buyer and seller mutually agree to reinstate the last fully agreed upon version of the above referenced agreement, such that it shall be a legally enforceable contract, including binding agreement date and binding upon the parties, as if it had never been terminated. Number 2, all of the terms, conditions, and time periods set forth in the above referenced agreement shall remain in full force and in effect, except for any changes thereto set forth below, which shall control over any conflicting or inconsistent provisions set forth in the above reference agreement. And then there's fill in the blanks if you want to change something. I'll get to that in just a minute. And then you can add additional pages. And then number 3, this agreement to reinstate the contract shall only be effective when it has been signed by buyer and seller, and a fully executed copy of this agreement to reinstate the contract has been delivered to the buyer and the seller within the accordance or within the provisions of the notice section of the actual contract. By signing this agreement to reinstate the contract, buyer and seller acknowledge that they have read and understand this agreement to reinstate the contract and agree to the terms. Okay. What does all that mean? When do you use it? So forth and so on. So basically, when a contract is terminated, it is terminated. And once it is terminated unilaterally. And that means that the party has terminated their rights with respect to the contract, not necessarily for the other party for default, so forth and so on. But if a contract had simply expired, the parties weren't initiating a termination of their rights to the contract. It just simply expired per the time frames that the parties had agreed to. So, generally speaking, prior to this, if a contract had simply expired and the buyer and the seller wanted to reinstate the contract, they could amend the contract to bring it back to life, so to speak. However, once a contract had been terminated, it could not be amended back into life. You needed a whole new contract. You needed a brand new purchase and sale agreement because the party, one of the parties, or both, if it had been terminated mutually, had terminated their rights with respect to the contract. You can't amend a dead contract. You can amend an expired contract, but not a dead one. So, the problem we were having is we were having agents. Most generally, we were having buyer's agents who were terminating contracts on behalf of the buyers, or not the agents, but the buyers were terminating contracts prior to the end of an agreed upon contingency time frame so that they protected their earnest money. However, there were still things going on in the background, and the buyer still really wanted the house and the seller still really wanted to sell the house. But if other things couldn't fall into place, the buyer was not willing to lose their earnest money. So the best alternative was to terminate the contract to protect their earnest money. Then the things all worked out, and they're like, well, we want to go back into contract. Let's just write an amendment. And it's like, no, you can't write an amendment. You have to start with a brand new purchase and sale agreement. All good and well until our lenders looked at that. And the lender said, no, we need just an amendment to the terminated contract. If you start with a brand new purchase and sale agreement, we have to start a whole new loan process. And in some instances, the buyer might have to wait 30 days. So we had all kinds of issues. And there were certain situations where attorneys wrote a full page of legalese to make sure that legally the buyers and the sellers' rights were protected with respect to a contract. But as a broker advising agents and as an agent with readily available forms to use, there wasn't anything really for you guys to use, or for brokers who are not attorneys. Now, if there was a broker who's an attorney, that might be a different situation. But generally speaking, of brokers who are not attorneys, to advise you what to write to legally protect your clients for their interest with respect to a contract that had been terminated without the terminating, with a contract that had been terminated. Additionally, what happens when a contract gets terminated? Well, there's two parts to a termination. One is the termination, and what's the other part? Yep, that's right. The disbursement of earnest money. So upon the termination of the previous contract, you can't just bring it back to life because we had to disperse earnest money per the terminated contract. So there were all kinds of issues. And again, the main reason or prompting for this form is number one, because the lending process was really affected by a new contract, and it was potentially putting buyers in a situation where they could not get the house they wanted, because if they had to wait 30 days, the house was going to be gone. Number two, it took brokers off the hook of trying to be attorneys and write a special stipulation to legally protect our buyers and sellers without writing a whole brand new contract. So this is a form to reinstate a contract that had been terminated, not in full force and effect until it is fully signed by the buyer and the seller. So let me give you a couple of situations, and let me tell you some things that you might want to write in that fill in the blank for the changes. So for example, I gave you the general reason, but more specifically, let's say you've got a buyer and a seller under contract, and let's say the appraisal comes in and the appraisal comes in low, and the parties have petitioned the appraiser and the lender for an appraisal review to raise the appraisal price closer to the sale price because the parties aren't going to agree to sell the contract on the appraised price. Well, time goes on. It takes a little time for an appraisal review. The buyer does not want to lose their earnest money. So what was happening is we were having a lot of buyers that were actually terminating the contract prior to the end of their appraisal contingency time frame in order to protect their earnest money. They still wanted the house, but they weren't willing to lose the earnest money, and the appraisal review process had not yet been completed, so the buyer and the seller weren't sure what the final sale price of the house was going to be negotiated to. Well, terminated, and then a couple days later, or whatever time frame later, they get back the appraisal review, and it's at such a price where the buyer and the seller agree to move forward for the purchase of the house. Well, at that point, we have a terminated contract, have disbursement of earnest money or proposed disbursement of earnest money, and the parties wanted to continue with the deal. Well, you had to write a whole new contract. Well, then the lender couldn't lend in a timely manner on a whole new contract. So that would be a situation where you would use this reinstatement. Let me see, what is it called again? Agreement to reinstate contract. And again, you'll notice it's not an exhibit, obviously, because it's after a binding contract. It's not an amendment because, as I said before, you cannot amend a dead contract. Basically, it is a standalone agreement, which is why there's a mention of consideration for enforceability. It is a standalone agreement that basically pulls back in the last version, fully executed version of the binding contract with the terms binding upon the buyer and the seller. So that would be a situation where this would definitely be appropriate. What changes would you put in? Because the other section, it does have, it says in paragraph 2, all of the terms, conditions, and time periods set forth in the above reference agreement shall remain in full force and effect, except for any changes thereto set forth below. So what would you change? This isn't, you're not really using this form as an amendment to the contract. But in this instance, since you are reinstating the contract, and it's typically going to be at least a few days after the termination, well, the binding agreement date is still the binding agreement date of the contract. So what happens if there were still some contingency timeframes that had not yet expired, but have expired by the time you reinstate the contract? So you might want to change the deadline of a contingency timeframe, financing, for example, financing contingency, or the appraisal contingency timeframe. Because let's just say you've got the word that the appraisal review has come back. But contractually speaking, between the buyer and the seller, there are still notices and timeframes and procedures that have to happen for the parties to agree to that. So what would change there might be, again, what I can think of right now is a financing contingency timeframe or an appraisal contingency timeframe. So one other thing you need to be aware of, there are no times mentioned right now on this form. And in the Train the Trainer class that I took, I did ask the GAR Forms Committee if there were any time frames within which the parties can use this form to reinstate a terminated contract. There was no answer to that. So we will have to see what happens as time goes on. But why I'm bringing that to your attention is, as I mentioned earlier, if you terminate a contract, you have to disperse the earnest money. So when you are using this form to reinstate a terminated contract, you need to check with the holder of the earnest money and to see what has happened with the disbursement of the earnest money. So that, that might be something to address also in those changes, that the earnest money is not dispersed or there's no earnest money moving forward or so forth and so on. So those are a couple of things to take into consideration when using this form. So again, change for 2021 from the Georgia Association of Realtors. And again, it is called Agreement to Reinstate Contract, and it is GAR form number 290. What do you think? Comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and stay tuned for more contract tips on the changes to the 2021 Georgia Association of Realtors contract forms. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.